Hi, welcome to Tokyo on Fire. My name's Timothy Langley. Today is March 13th. I'm joined with my colleague, Michael Chuchek. Michael Chuchek is Adjunct Fellow at Temple University in the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. He's also the famous author of Shisaku, the foremost blog on Japanese politics. Today, our burning issue is the 70th anniversary of the end of the Pacific War. Today, we're going to talk about the implications of that date as it approaches September 2nd and the background goings-on for statements that will be written, events that will be held to celebrate the end of the war. Michael, what do you think the end of the war means to us 70 years later?
Well, celebration's a great word, and certainly for a lot of Japanese, celebration is perhaps the better word than the word that's going to be used, which is commemoration.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of commemorative events because there were, in the last years of the war, the most bloody and the most awful events, at least of the Pacific War. The bombings of Tokyo, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we had the Battle of Okinawa. These will all be commemorated this year in the set for the, and it's very likely that since it's been 70 years, this is the last time that there will be persons present, or at least a 10-year anniversary where there will be persons present who were there, who were participants, except as children. We may have at the 80th some children who remember the bombings, but this is the last time where we have combatants and persons who were adults. They're in their 90s, late 90s now. So this is, in many ways, a last chance to clear the decks and clear accounts. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the participants in East Asia are thinking of just along those lines.
One of the reasons why this is a burning issue for us is because the Prime Minister will make a speech and write a declaration commemorating the 70th anniversary. And as I understand it, the Emperor will also do likewise. He'll make a presentation or a speech. And there's some trebitude, some nervousness about what the Prime Minister might say with regard to the end of the war and what the Emperor might say.
Yeah, the Emperor is actually pretty safe. The Imperial family in the last decade has reemerged as the voice against the war. And it's been really remarkable in the terms of the continuity that has been reestablished. About 10 years ago, when there was dissension within the family about basically the succession, there were no male heirs for the throne after the current crown prince and his brother. The thought that the imperial line could end started to create tensions, and they were talking about different things. Now they're on the same message, and it's the message established by the current emperor. He is profoundly affected psychologically by the war and its end and how it transformed his world and the world of his father, the famed emperor Hirohito, the Showa emperor. Mm-hmm. His son, the Heisei emperor, who now is ruling, is at the end of his time. He probably would like to retire as emperor, but no emperor has retired in a very, very long time. The Taisho emperor was pushed to the side, the emperor prior to the Showa emperor, and his son was appointed regent. But we had in Japan retired emperors, people who could get out of all the ceremonies that the emperor has to do. That is something that probably the present emperor wants to do, but in order to maintain the dignity and continuity of the house, doesn't. He, however, realizes this is his last chance, basically, to make a statement, and he'll make a really strong statement against war in general. There's no question that the countries around East Asia have come to accept the imperial house as the nation, the nation of Japan's conscience. Mm-hmm. By contrast, Prime Minister Abe has created a great deal of nervousness throughout the region and within Japan that he's going to get up on a very high pedestal and then blow his performance. That he's going to deliver a statement on this 70th anniversary that will disappoint or even anger the countries immediately next to Japan, South Korea, and China, and possibly even the United States, because he has a history of hemming, hedging, or even completely denying Japan's less attractive features in the pre-1945 era.
Mm-hmm.
So he's coming up on that, and he has appointed a commission.
He's got a commission, doesn't he?
He has a commission of 16 very astute international businessmen, diplomats, former diplomats, scholars, who are going to advise him, not tell him, advise him on what should be in the speech and what shouldn't. And we had a big development this week when the number 2 on that commission, Professor Shinichi Kitaoka, who has been previously seen as a very conservative voice among the Prime Minister's advisors, said in a speech, the Prime Minister better say the word invasion of Asia. He has to use the word invasion, shinryaku, or else the speech is not going to go well. That's exactly the word that the Prime Minister has always avoided saying. And when he's been asked about it in the Diet, he said, well, you know, the word invasion has many meanings. And historians have to decide what that meaning is, not us politicians. So he's been pressed on this before, and it hasn't gone well.
Well, it depends on what the definition of is. But you would think that there would be some opportunity for a matching of the messages between the imperial household and the Prime Minister's office.
No, they don't get along very well. It's not formal, it's not out in the open, but it's clear that the Imperial House has been pressing as hard as it can. It's a very constricted and constrained forum for them. They are the guardians of a 2,000-year tradition, a single family that has been ruling Japan for that entire time.
The oldest surviving monarchy in the entire history of mankind.
No, it's exactly. It's a dynasty that has lasted far, far longer than anywhere else in the world. Right. And the present emperor is quite aware that he is the steward of that tradition. So he does not want to disturb the apple cart. He doesn't want to push very hard. But nevertheless, there have been very interesting words that have made their way into his statements and the statements of his son, such as correct history. What does correct history mean? We should remember correct history. Who's doing the incorrect history is the question that immediately comes to mind. And one has to think that it's a message to the Prime Minister that there are some things that cannot be denied. And you've been on the wrong side of history.
Well, a lot of what we talk about is Japanese politics, Japanese politicians, machinations that go on Japan's version of Capitol Hill in Nagatacho. And there certainly seems to be a bit of disdain from the imperial household and maybe from the bureaucracy as well towards politicians in general. I think this is a long-standing kind of sentiment that you are elected officials, but you're feeding off the government trough, and you really are, you're pushing laws through, but it's how you do your business is not really as respected as what we are doing.
Well, certainly they have the sense that they are the permanent guardians of the national tradition, and you politicians are here today, gone tomorrow.
That's right.
But of course, they're not here today, gone tomorrow. They get elected over and over again, and then their sons get elected, and then their grandsons and their granddaughters, and whatever. So there are two elites that are battling it out. One which goes to the people every few years and says, "Are we doing okay?"
Are we okay?
And the others who, through their hierarchy and their long tradition, say, we are doing okay, right? Yes, to themselves, basically. But yeah, there is still a lot of disdain. But again, the changes under the Abe administration in terms of how the personnel agency works, where the personnel agency was basically self-governing and now has been brought under the complete control of the Prime Minister's office and the private residence of the Prime Minister. That has all been pulled into the Naikaku and the Kante, so that whereas in the past, bureaucrats may have had some leeway to talk down or spread rumors about politicians or especially about the current administration. If they want to advance nowadays, they have to please politicians and they have to be close to politicians. And politicians have to know them and they have to interact in a way that didn't exist 2 years ago before Abe came into office.
This creeping encroachment on the public sphere, the bureaucracies, the military, the Department of Defense, is also a part and parcel of that. They're slowly being directed to come into the Prime Minister's, the Sorifu, the residence of the Prime Minister, or the office of the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
That's really alarming, isn't it?
It's not so much alarming as that it's different. There was so much in the post-war era, the responsibilities and the centers of power were so dispersed that the sense that the Prime Minister was the director or the CEO of the country never had any traction. At best, he was the custodian of the country. Now, however, since the reforms done under Hashimoto in 96, 97, which were furthered under Koizumi.
Koizumi
did a lot to centralize powers and decision-making in the Kante. And then we had the 4th anniversary this year of the 3/11 disaster, the triple disaster of earthquake, tsunami, and then the nuclear accident at Fukushima. The management of that showed that there still was a long way to go in terms of bringing information into the Kante and then being able to use that information and sending it out as orders all around the country. It wasn't a bad response, but it could have been better. And all these things, these movements over the years, and then this sudden intrusion of this disaster, have all made it possible for Abe to come in and say, I need more. And basically, the other members of the LDP say, okay.
Yeah. What else are they going to say?
Well, in the past, when the factions were strong, it was a different story, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, when we first came here, the factions still were standing.
They ruled.
And nowadays, the factions are there basically for parties and fundraising. So you could get to meet people and you get to donate. But that's all. They can't force Prime Minister Abe to put whomever they want in the cabinet. They tried in this last round when he did the cabinet reshuffle, and the longtime Tanaka faction, which is now run by Nukaga faction. He forced Abe to put in Obuchi Yuko as Minister of Economics, Trade, and Industry, and that went disastrously.
Yes.
She's had to resign very quickly in the scandals of the fall, and now that faction, it can't enforce its will. It used to be the biggest faction, and all the other factions are quite small as compared to the faction that produced the prime minister. Was the Fukuda faction in the historical times.
Right.
Yeah, that's right, the Seimukai. This means that there's no one to oppose the prime minister now. With the former Tanaka faction on its back, it just leaves the prime minister and nobody else.
I don't want to get too far away from the 70th year commemoration, but something you said sparks another thought in my mind, and that is, we went from Hashimoto, Koizumi, and at around that time also, a reconstruction of the prime minister's residence, and also the reconstruction of all of the Diet buildings that house the individual members of the parliament. And you look at that building and the complex there, it is massive compared to what it used to be. And even back then, you could tell there was a sense that there is a growing into this domination, this role of Japan in the world, economically at least, and a desire for the political realm, which includes Kante as well, the bureaucracy, to project we can handle these kinds of things. We need this kind of structure to project our image around the world and also to get things done. And then we had the triple disaster. We had the anniversary just a couple of days ago.
Where the hardware was there.
The hardware was there, yes. They're kind of growing into it even now.
Yeah, but the software wasn't.
Yes.
The ability to communicate with people, the ability to get straight answers from people, the ability to place people there whom you could trust, did not exist. And that was what made the personnel reforms that the Abe administration had asked for so convincing. Whether they're going to do good by it is another question entirely. In terms of that old building, the old residence that we know, it's full of a lot of ghosts, and a lot of them of the pre-war era. It was in that building that was broken into on February the 26th. We also had a commemoration of that. That's a big date in Japanese history, where the Imperial Palace was surrounded by rebel soldiers in 1936, and
invaded.
They invaded. They stabbed to death the Minister of Finance. They tried to kill the Prime Minister. They killed many heads of industry. It was an attempted coup d'état, and that building was one of them that they had seized. So it has ghosts. So the new building doesn't have that.
Yes.
But it is also a statement that Japan has finally arrived, and it's good that statement was made, I think. And that is reflected in many things. The Diet members' offices have all been redone. They used to look like...
They're beautiful now.
They're beautiful now. They used to look like the worst high school in the inner city in the United States. I couldn't believe it when I first came here. And I would go to a Diet member's office, these tiny cubby holes in these linoleum-floored places. I said, this cannot be the world's second largest economy. But you remember those.
Sure.
Oh, God,
yes.
That was awful.
It was, and the boxes of papers and documents that are literally everywhere. A staff of maybe 3, no more than 3. You can't have more than 3, logistically, and the inside office for the member.
It was a different time.
Very different.
In terms of the commemorations, I think that the Okinawa commemoration in June of the Battle of Okinawa is going to be really fraught. We've seen a lot of protests at the Henoko
It's getting hot there, isn't
site. Even yesterday, they were peeling people off the fence, telling people who were trying to protest the simple test boring. They're boring holes into the seabed for testing to see if where the bedrock is, so that when they finally do, and it's almost inevitable that they will, put in the landfill landing runways that are there for the American base that they're going to build there. They're doing all the preliminary work for that. After what? When was the agreement? The incident was in 1995. I guess so. The agreement was in 97, along with the revised defense guidelines, saying we're going to move Futenma to Henoko. And since 1997, it's just been delayed. But now they're actually doing it, and the protests are ongoing. And we have the 70th anniversary of Okinawa's sacrifice to save the Hondo, to save the main islands. And the Okinawans have never forgiven the mainlanders for being the only land battle on Japanese national soil.
Yes, well, you can't really characterize that as a love-hate relationship. It's mostly just a hate-hate relationship, isn't it?
Well, it's a disdain-hate
It is, yeah.
relationship. There's a lot of looking down on the Okinawans. They were outside of Japanese authority for a long time, until 1972, when the reversion took place. So there was a time that they were Americans.
That's right.
From 45 all the way to 72, and
so they're strange.
They're strange.
Hentai.
They're strange. They eat funny foods.
That's right.
They sing and dance, and they always seem to need subsidies.
Yes.
So there's a lot of disdain on this side. On the Okinawan side is you guys in 1951, and then again in 1960, signed agreements with the United States about bases in Japan. In Japan, then why are 70% of all bases now in Okinawa? We weren't a part of that discussion. We were outside of the authority of your government at that time. How can we be the ones who are hosting most of the U.S. forces now? And that's a pretty good question.
Yeah. Well, Okinawa is a very special place. It is, of all the prefectures, the one that has the lowest amount of physical income of the people who live there. It's also got the highest unemployment rate. Mm-hmm. So it is really something strange of all of the other prefectures. And it's somewhat strange because it really is an island. It could possibly be a resort island. I mean, it's not that large an island. It does have some resources, but it does seem to be somewhat retarded in its growth and in its development. And I think that's largely as a result of the incredible domination of air bases and military forces, U.S. military forces that are there.
There's people who argue that, but the Okinawans have had a pretty good deal in some ways. And it's reflected in that they are among the longest living, if they're not the longest living, of all Japanese, who are the longest living people in the world, which makes them the longest living people in the world. It's the only place in Japan where there's even close to replacement rate in terms of births. They have lots of children as compared to Japanese on the mainland. Yes, they are poorer, but they seem to live a happier life. So there's a trade-off that's being made somewhere, but certainly the trade-off that was made at their expense, which is here in Tokyo, where we live, all the major bases except for Yokota have been closed, and they're basically closing down Atsugi as a U.S. naval base, leaving it only for the self-defense forces. But everywhere, so we have these gigantic parks like Showa Kinen Koen in Tachikawa. That was an airfield, an air base that was turned over to the government, which was then turned over to Tokyo, and it became a huge park. And so many of the facilities have been closed down on the main islands and returned either to the prefecture or to the national government. Instead, all of the forces that used to be based here on the main islands are now have been shunted onto the giant bases on Okinawa.
Well, I understand that there were a couple of projects that were considered, and one of them was, rather than basing everything in Okinawa, let's move them to Guam. But then they discovered that if so many soldiers go there, Guam will actually flip over.
That was an idiot Democrat in the U.S. Congress, and as a Democrat, I am deeply ashamed of that statement.
As you should be.
As I should be. Well, he later explained it was meant metaphorically. I certainly hope so. But
it looked metaphorical to me.
Yes. Well, in this case, the Guam is an interesting island.
It's not Okinawa, though.
It's not Okinawa, but what is really interesting is that it is almost as if it were co-owned by Japan and the United States. Guam, if you go there, the bus service is basically run for the Japanese by the Japanese. All the signage is in Japanese. Everybody who gets in on or off it has a pass from a Japanese travel agency. A local, if he or she tries to get on, has to pay $4 just to get on the bus. And that's a lot of money in Guam. It's a lot of money anywhere just to get on. Now, Guam was, of course, a part of the United States,
a protectorate
that was occupied by Japanese forces and taken over. So it's a part of that history as well, and it's a part of the commemorative tradition, and certainly there'll be events there having to do with what is going on. This year is going to be just one commemoration after another. Celebration. I keep using the word celebration, but it's wrong.
It's not really a celebration. You're right. It is a commemoration.
There's a celebration for some people, certainly for the Communist Party of Japan, which was banned under the pre-1945 administration.
Celebration for women?
Celebration for women who got the right to vote first time.
Celebration for democracy?
Celebration. Maybe? Well, democracy
Maybe.
existed, and that's one of the arguments that the prime minister will make. Japan has been and was a democratic state, and even during its so-called dark period, it still had elections, and they had, and social democrats. Well, you could almost call them agrarian Democrats, were still winning seats in the Diet in 1937, 1938, when the elections took place. It was not as if there was a massive turnover into a dictatorial state. There were actual leftists in the Diet right up until the beginning of the Pacific War. So while everyone dumps on Abe for having very strange views of history, it's not as if it's completely off base.
Mm-hmm. Right. Let's talk a little bit about what happened 70 years ago and how different it is now and what it was like kind of back then. And to start that off, everything happened really quickly. The Battle of Okinawa, it ended in August, and then there was the atomic bombings, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and then the war ended. And the commemoration is on September 2nd when the signing of the actual peace treaty occurred. Is that right?
Well, in this case, that would be the American view. The Japanese view is, of course, the August 15th Emperor's first radio address ever. Was not live, it was recorded, but it was the first time that anyone had ever heard his voice on August the 15th, 1945, announcing that Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration and accept unconditional surrender. Because, in the words of the Emperor, the war has not gone as exactly as planned.
It hasn't gone particularly well for us.
And that has not gone well for us. Understatement of the Century Award.
Right.
In this case, that's when the hot stuff is going to happen. The Prime Minister makes his statement. They have the commemoration with the Emperor at the Nippon Budokan in the morning, like they do every year. But I suppose it'll have a few more people wheeled in than ever before. Last year, one of the statistics that the newspapers always quote is how many fewer people are seated in the Izokai seats, the war-bereaved seats, each year. And I think they'll scour the retirement homes of Japan to fill up those seats this last time, because it's in a sense, I mean, it's normal. It is becoming history rather than being living history or living memory. But at the same time, so much remains unresolved, at least in the eyes of East Asia.
And there's a lot of shame that's affiliated with it too. I mean, even people who served proudly in the military services are, because of the result of the war, we did not win, and I actually came back alive. There's, based on traditional thought and traditional aspirations of the people to live on behalf of the emperor, there's still something of a shamefulness that's assigned to that.
And also beyond that, there are those one aspect of the war which may not come out this year, but it's really kind of questionable because, as you said, there was the Soviet Union's entry into the war immediately after the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima.
Right in between them.
Yeah. Suddenly realized that the game had changed.
What an opportunity.
It was indeed. But for the Japanese side, and if you look at the statements, particularly Koizumi's statement in 2005, he talks about specifically those who were left behind outside Japan after the war. And what that is code word for is the gulags of the Soviet Union, the tens of thousands of Japanese who were captured in Manchuria and taken to Siberia and worked in the prison camps there and were there well into the 1950s. It was not an immediate repatriation. Repatriation at the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty Conference, Yoshida Shigeru basically danced around who was responsible, but made it very clear that the Soviet Union was beyond the pale. And that was why Japan is signing with the United States a security treaty. Mm-hmm. Hello, you people, you have our land. And that aspect was something that Abe Shinzo really did want to solve. We saw that in the first year, he visited with Putin 5-6 times. Either Putin came to Tokyo, or he went to Russia, or he went to international conferences. He met Putin constantly because he wanted, in this 70th commemorative year, to finally end World War II. Mm-hmm. Because World War II...
They haven't signed a peace treaty yet, have they?
No, it's not over.
It's not over. That's right.
The war is technically ongoing.
That's right. And why? These 4 islands up north, not only that, but the other issues too. This is so huge. And, living here, sometimes the loudest concoction that you're going to hear on Tokyo streets are the election campaign vehicles that drive by during election time. Mm-hmm. That pales in comparison when the right wing is upset about the return of the Northern Islands, or they demonstrate in front of the Soviet Union embassy, or they're just driving around town.
If you go to the hill on which the Russian embassy stands, hilariously, it's right next to the American club. Yes. What is there on both sides of that street? I mean, it's a huge avenue. Gates. Mm-hmm. And those gates can be pulled shut in an instant because why? Every Tuesday and every Thursday, the big black trucks come and they actually pretend to charge the gates. Mm-hmm. It's a bit of a dance. It's a really not a strong enough gate to really stop a speeding bus, but they stop and the policemen just get the gate all the way across just as the bus is about to arrive. So maybe there's a little bit of coordination going on. But that area is in total lockdown all the time. Mm-hmm. And it's because of those 4 islands, and that is not going to be resolved. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge disappointment to Abe Shinzo, because he clearly was working Putin really hard the first year. But then, of course, the Ukraine and the Crimea happened. And in the Crimea this week, we have the visit of former Prime Minister Hatoyama going to the Crimea.
Well, that stirred up a little bit of a hornet's nest, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It absolutely is. Well, luckily, he's seen as a complete lunatic now. Everybody used to call him the alien because of his looks and because of his spacey way of talking. But really, he has put himself way beyond this universe in terms of his visits, and his talk, his visits to China, his visits to Iran. He's gone way off the deep end. And now, by visiting Crimea and declaring that the referendum there was democratic, he has turned off not only Japanese, but he's turned off the entire world. But not so long ago, in fact, last year, and just around this time, Abe was in Sochi at the Olympics, very prominently. No Western leader would go because of the controversy about about the Russian gay, lesbian, and transgender those laws that made such the transmission of homosexuality illegal. Homosexuality wasn't illegal, but somehow teaching people to become homosexuals was illegal. A really bizarre kind of thing. But no Western leader showed up except Abe at the Sochi opening of the Sochi Olympics. So he was surrounded by all these dictators from Central Asia. And here he was, the one of the few elected leaders. He was really working it hard. And it's fallen apart completely. And it's something that he would have wanted to have as his crowning achievement in this 70th year.
Speaking once again about the end of the war and the displaced Japanese citizens who were spread throughout Southeast Asia. And when the war collapsed, the armed forces were supposed to be repatriated. Not all of them made it, as you talk about. But there were civilians as well throughout all of Manchuria, Northern Korea, China as well. And in their sprint to get back to the homelands, many people were left behind. And there are lots of really horribly sad stories of children who were left there, young children, because otherwise we can't carry you. We have these packages and we have some...
Or we might be caught and killed.
Right.
You know.
And there are plenty of Japanese citizens who have been left there who are now 50, 60, 70 years old, older than that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, the repatriation issue was huge in the 90s. And the images of not exactly airliner fulls of elderly Chinese coming to Japan and saying, "Hi, I am so-and-so's brother. I am so-and-so's sister.
Is anybody here?
Is anyone here?"
Yes.
Yeah. I know my parents told me that I was adopted, that I was actually a Japanese child. And, you know, that of course, with those people are now at least 75, 78. They're getting up there in age. And a lot of them tried to come back. Some of them assimilated.
It's hard, isn't it?
It's very difficult. Most of them didn't. That legacy is certainly a leftover. There may be commemorations of that. I haven't heard about it, though.
I mean, because it became something of a big news item about 6 years ago, and people would be coming in and they would be looking for their relatives, and to be just standing at the tarmac, nobody's there, nobody has accepted or acknowledged them. There were cases like that too, and how sad that must be for them to have been brought up by Chinese parents and learn their heritage and have an opportunity to come back to the motherland and find out that maybe my heritage is gone, is dead, or maybe they're just not coming to the surface because they've moved on in their lives.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about the latter issue because we see a lot in Japan still about the issue of repatriation, not just of the living, but of the dead.
Oh, yes.
And the return of remains. We had recently on NHK the story of one family that is currently in a very gentlemanly, but still a dispute with the government of Australia, having found out that their missing relative actually died known in an Australian prison camp, POW camp, was interred there honorably in the cemetery and has a plaque and everything with his name on it. They would like the remains returned to them. And the Australians say, yeah, but that would really be sort of messing with history. And it's a very delicate issue, but it's very, very prominent. And it may be very difficult for Japanese to understand that sometimes you can't bring them back. We have the big battle, of course, also this year, Iwo Jima, as we would say in the United States, a huge battle that also took place. And where many, many Americans died, but many, many more Japanese defenders died, and tens of thousands are missing from that battle on this tiny island that their remains are under hundreds of thousands of tons of rock.
Because it's still closed, isn't it?
It's still
island
closed.
is basically closed.
It's basically closed. It's still covered with unexploded ordnance. There's just no safe place to walk on it, really. They have one runway, which is used for practice takeoffs and landings, both by American and by the SDF forces. But once you get off that tarmac and into the sand and into the rock, you're taking your life in your hands. And so the remains have not been brought back. And there will be a flight of relatives, of selected relatives, obviously not all of them, which will come in and land on that island. And on behalf of all those who lost their loved ones in that battle, will be offering prayers to this land, this pile of rock and dirt, because the remains cannot be brought home.
There was something in the newspaper just a couple of days ago, if I recall, about them discovering yet another entrance to one of the tunnel complexes in Iwo Jima. And I thought that was really interesting. You probably only need to kick over a couple of, clumps of dirt to find something like that there.
Yeah, it was absolutely riddled. The American assessment was that it was a work of genius in the defense of that island, that it was just absolutely honeycombed with tunnels, most of which the entrances collapsed in the massive bombardment that U.S. ships and airplanes gave it. But what really matters for Japanese there is ikotsu, the return of bones. And that's true even with the very, very fraught relationship with North Korea. The return of the remains of Japanese there is really the only thing that connects the two countries now. So the return of Japanese has not yet happened fully. And that's a psychological scar that is also going to come up in this 70th year.
Well, speaking of the returns, how about the fabulous discovery by the co-founder of Microsoft of the second largest battleship in the Philippine coast?
That's right, the Musashi.
Wasn't that amazing?
Yeah, well, it's one rather sardonic person said, yes, it's just where the Americans left it.
Yes.
Yeah, the sinking of the Musashi and of the Yamato.
Right, two fabulous, highly technical,
extraordinary, the largest ships of their kind ever made, completely wasted in a military sense, especially in the Yamato's case, which was sent
to
Okinawa to relieve Okinawa with 5,000 sailors aboard who perished.
It was on a kamikaze run.
It was on a kamikaze run where the kamikaze was the largest piece of steel that had ever floated, ever. And yes, the Musashi was rediscovered by
70 years.
Paul Ellman. Yeah, it's been a long time at the bottom. And that also, the first reaction of the person, I was watching someone on television, someone said, there are probably thousands of young men's remains in there. And it's not something I'd immediately think of, but it was the first thing on that person's mind. And the person was a Japanese citizen.
Yes. The huge changes, I mean, take a look at even just 40 years or maybe 40, 50 years to imagine, number one, Japan blossoming into the kind of country that it has become. But even more personally important is how the people have been accepted and blended or melded with other people throughout the world. When the Pacific War started, it was like Japan was a black box. They eat with sticks. They worship gods. They have a whole system and a whole culture that we just can't even understand. And they're fighting. Their techniques of fighting and preferring death over survival in certain situations. It's just such an alien concept to us. And throughout this time, they have matured into the country that we are in now. I'm married to a Japanese girl. I think my father, who fought in World War II, he probably wouldn't have been able to accept that until, after I had become much older and left the family and started my own life. But what a huge difference, huge, between what was then and what is now. And I guess you can say that about the whole world, but in particular, it seems that Japan really has, in 70 years, done just something magical and magnificent.
Well, we saw at the Academy Awards this year, the film that won in the animation category, which is called Big Hero 6 in English, and here in Japan it's called Baymax. Where does it take place? In a city that's a melding of San Francisco and Tokyo together. And the maker of it, the head of Disney Studios, Lasseter, very consciously says, I'm deeply indebted to Japanese anime. And at this same Academy Awards, the special award for achievement was given to Miyazaki Hayao of Studio Ghibli, that the great master of Japanese animation, who has given so much to the world. So at this very, very American ceremony, and this year, embarrassingly Caucasian ceremony, as they said, was the criticism of it, because there were no people of color in the major acting categories being honored. Nevertheless, in this particular instance, in terms of animation, the debt to Japan and to Japanese culture was acknowledged and celebrated. And that's amazing when you think, again, when you're trying to think of the Ruth Benedict view of the Japanese as these really alien people. Now we are deeply and I hope permanently interlocked.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think? We've got the 70th commemoration coming up. What would be the most positive thing that could be said, or the kind of message that could be conveyed, particularly not to the eastern side, but to the western side, about what Japan stands for and what Japan hopes to achieve after 70 years? Certainly there's a lot of bubbling resentment, and it's more than resentment. It really is deep and difficult to resolve, I think. Sometimes just saying you're sorry is good enough, and that's essentially what the Chinese are asking for. Admit what you did. You invaded us, you killed us, and so you should accept that. And I think the Japanese stance is, we developed you, we helped you, and as a consequence of that expansion, it was not something that we were doing in isolation. Every major advanced country was doing the same thing, and because of our development of your resources and your industries, you also came up, and it wasn't our fault that somebody started a war with us, but we had to pull the trigger when things got tough.
Well, you see, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, also turned up.
She was here just this week.
Just this week, and her answer would be, yes, it would be nice if the countries of China and South Korea would be more receptive toward Japanese apologies, but it would be also nice if the apologies were unequivocal.
Yes.
And that they were straight up, you say what you did, and she says, you're right, you have a problem. We had France as our major partner, and the French government and the people of France committed themselves to a better relationship with Germany, so that what Germany has done, and that's always the comparison for Japan, what Germany has done. Look at what Germany has done. And Oe Kenzaburo, Japan's Nobel Prize winner in literature, I went to his press conference this week at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. He just talked the whole time about how wonderful the Germans are. It was kind of disconcerting, even embarrassing to listen to him, talking so almost in a sycophantic way, complimenting German thinking in terms of war, but also in terms of the nuclear issue, is what he was talking about. But Angela Merkel came here and made some very serious statements about the way it would be best for Japan to handle the war issue. And it actually ticked off the foreign minister, Mr. Kishida, a little
I would
bit.
imagine.
He said, well, that's not her business, kind of thing. But not in he was a little bit more diplomatic than that. So, yeah, but with this example of the Germans physically coming into contact, it's a hard sell.
Well, it's like the Tokyo Olympics, which is in another 6 years, 5 years.
No, 5. Yeah, they're behind schedule.
They are behind schedule. But the Tokyo Olympics is an opportunity for Japan to take it to the next level, to be it's an opportunity to really showcase what Japan has become and what Japan is going to become. And similarly, I think this event of commemoration for 70 years is an opportunity. And I'm hopeful that they'll take that opportunity and do something with it. I just don't know how much that expectation could realistically be met, because it is hard. It is hard. I think the Japanese, who were utterly defeated and the whole nation was, basically a ruin, could apologize for things that they thought they were doing in the best interests of their nation.
Yeah, well, we were you and I were both at a conference yesterday, where from the floor came a question regarding the Olympics and opening up Japan. And the person who gave the question, as a proposition, said, my guess is that about 70% of the tourists that'll come in 2020 are going to be Chinese.
Yes, that's true.
And he said, are we going to be ready? And he was talking about technology. He was talking about credit cards being usable, phones being usable. But it's the political side too. Are we going to be open enough to the possibilities that exist in this post-70th anniversary world? Abe is going to have, he wants to be associated with the Olympics. It would be a miracle if he were still the prime minister at that time. He has to change the bylaws of his own party to do it. But he really has been pushing the Olympics hard as a theme. And one of the aspects of that is reconciliation with East Asia, because that's, from South Korea and from China, is the closest. It's the people who are almost in the same time zone. They are lots of money. In the case of China, there must be 30, 40, by that time, maybe 50 million millionaires who can make this trip and make it and have the ability to do so. And if there is the software, not just the technological software, but the human software established, there's a huge opportunity there.
Well, we just had Chinese New Year, and I think half of those millionaires actually visited.
That's right, yes.
I think the economy actually got a good tick out of that. Because
definitely. It's a great week for Japan. People say it's a crazy week in China. It was a crazy week here.
I understand in Okinawa, too, that Okinawa is a very hot spot for Chinese visitors.
Well, it's just across the water.
Yes.
Which is good and bad.
Well, with that, I'd like to draw to a close today's conversation. You've been watching Tokyo on Fire. We've been talking about the 70th commemoration of the end of the Pacific War. You can download our podcast on iTunes, or you can watch the video on YouTube under the incendiary name of Tokyo on Fire. Post your comments using Twitter at #TokyoOnFire, or you can send us your comments to comments@tokyoonfire.com. My name's Timothy Langley. Thank you very much for joining us.